Hello, students. Welcome back. Time to talk about some of the basic themes of Rerum Novarum, which was written in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII. This encyclical is certainly not the first time that popes address social matters. Popes have been writing about these things throughout the history of the church, talking about the situation that they saw in the world. Nor is it even the first encyclical to deal with communism. Pius IX, for example, wrote an encyclical in 1849 against communism, which was the year after the Communist Manifesto was published. So this had already been dealt with. Why then do we consider Rerum Novarum the beginning of modern Catholic social teaching? I think for two reasons. One, he takes Pope Leo in this encyclical an open stance towards the modern reality. He realizes that the modern reality has shifted to capitalism, and he's open to working with the new system rather than looking backwards, as Pius IX arguably does, to prior economic systems. He's willing to deal with these revolutionary things, as the title of the encyclical means, rather than wishing for something that's not here now. So he works with what's in front of him, and then two, he does a wonderful job of proposing seminal principles that end up being developed throughout the rest of the history of modern social teaching to today. Principles, as we'll see on the next slide, and does that through a synthesis of traditional theology with modern thinking, modern philosophy, using especially the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas and engaging the modern philosophy, in particular, of John Locke, the British empiricist philosopher. Certain principles, such as the common good, the primacy of the family, the rights of workers, are all enunciated by Leo XIII in this encyclical. Those are going to be important throughout the history of Catholic social teaching. We'll talk about those further in future videos. Rerum Novarum, perhaps surprisingly, agreed with the Communist Manifesto in its analysis of the problems, more or less. Surprising because that's the Pope agreeing with the atheistic Marx on what he sees in the world. The first paragraph of Rerum Novarum enunciates the four principles above, which are in the Communist Manifesto. The one thing the Pope adds beyond these in that first paragraph to his analysis is the prevailing moral degeneracy. Pope Leo sees virtue as essential to counteract these problems, that if people don't grow in virtue, these problems aren't going to be solved in any other way, and in that way differs from the analysis of the Communist Manifesto, even in looking at the problems. In the solution, you couldn't get further apart. So to take perhaps the most fundamental disagreement, Marx and Engels would propose to get rid of religion, that religion would naturally fade away once communism comes about, and that it is not helpful now because it acts as an opiate. It keeps the people from rising up in revolution because they're thinking, oh, I'm going to get heaven later, therefore I don't need to change things now. Pope Leo XIII thinks quite on the contrary. He thinks that rather than abandoning God, what is needed is to seek God in a deeper and more profound way within society. One, simply because God is the greatest common good, and we as human beings are missing out on sharing that greatest common good when we forget Him within our society. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. We have a need for the higher things, and of those higher things, above all, the highest, who is God. And then two, because it's in God that we find our dignity, that we find our meaning, that we find that every human being is of value, regardless of who they are or what their situation is. They are of untold, inestimable value because they are made in the image of God. They have the mark of His goodness, His infinite goodness upon them. And Pope Leo would propose that it's going to be through recognizing the dignity of each person, the worker recognizing that in the employer in the worker, that this problem can be resolved. Pope Leo talks, I don't have a quote for this here, but he talks about the duties of the labor, for example, to do a good day's work for a good day's pay, and to not do violence to the employer. But he talks in particular about the duties that the employer has towards the laborer, because the laborer is in the weaker position. So he especially emphasizes that. You can see in the quote here that it's a duty on the employer not to misuse men as though they were things in the pursuit of gain. So human beings are not machines. They have dignity. They're made in the image and likeness of God, and they must be treated as such. They must be treated as beings that have dignity. Part of the way that he saw this dignity as coming to be recognized is through the use of labor unions and other associations. And that in two ways. One, Leo had the hope that unions, associations other than unions could be, for example, benevolent associations that would work to help widows of those who had died who were in that business, or to help children who were in need, that those could be places where employers and employees could work together, get to know each other, and through building a sort of friendship, come to a deeper respect, a deeper love for one another. And then the other would be through unions that working men could stand up for themselves, could stand together and say, these are our rights, we demand them, and have kind of the authority through that union, through that association, to achieve their ends, achieve a living wage, which means that a worker is paid enough to support themselves and their family, if they're frugal, if they're careful. That would be his idea of a living wage. They could stand up together through these unions and associations to try to achieve those goals. He says that states do not have the right to forbid people to associate. That association in private groups like this is a right of the human person and ought not to be curtailed. The rights of union to form were already being recognized in many countries, but that was something that was in flux at the time, and the Pope spoke into that reality and said, yes, this is a right, this is essential. The Pope also recognizes that there's times where the state needs to step in to fight injustice, and he encourages the state to pay attention to what's going on, to look for injustices, for places where people are being treated badly, poorly, especially employees being treated badly by their employer. And he said that the state can make regulations to protect them. So he's not a fan of laissez-faire capitalism, capitalism without any regulations or restrictions, if people are being injured in this process, if there's not adequate virtue among the employers to ensure that people are being paid a living wage, for example, or giving decent working hours, given safe working conditions, then the state should step in and regulate and make sure that people have these things. This is the first in modern Catholic social teaching enunciation of the principle of the preferential option for the poor. Because the poor do not have the same power that the rich have to protect themselves. Pope Leo notes that the rich have all sorts of ways that they can keep themselves safe because they have money, they have power, they have influence. The poor don't. So the government has to be especially sure to consider their needs when policy is being made. Lastly, the Pope notes that human persons have the right to own private property. This is his fundamental disagreement with communism. If communism somehow became theistic, believing in God, the Pope would still be opposed to it for this reason, that every person has a right to own private property, and that right ought not be taken away. It's taken away systemically by communism. People cannot own the means of production and therefore exercise their own creativity and freedom through the use of that property. The exception would be in a monastery, but in a monastery, you choose to enter that. Every person who's in the monastery chooses to give up this natural right of owning private property in order to take a vow of poverty and live within the monastery. That's a different thing. When it is compulsory, when because you belong to this country, you must give over your right to private property. In fact, it's not even a thing within the society. The Pope sees that as systemic theft, taking away the rights of the human persons. There are many other things in Rerum Novarum. Here are some of the essential points in response to the problems that the Pope is dealing with. We will look at some of these particular points in greater detail in later videos. God bless you. See you tomorrow.